So hello everyone and welcome to this panel discussion on the history of SIGACCESS, ACM's special interest group on accessible computing. You might know SIGACCESS is celebrating 50 years now of bringing together like-minded researchers and practitioners in accessibility. And today we hope you'll learn something about what that has meant throughout the years. SIGACCESS is the sponsoring organization of the ASSETS conference. And today we're going to reveal the answer to one of the enduring mysteries of ASSETS. What does ASSETS mean anyway? So stick around for that. I am Shari Trewin. I'm the program director of IBM Accessibility. I'm a self-confessed ASSETS superfan. I'm the past chair of SIGACCESS, and I'm your host for today's conversation. And with me, I have a distinguished panel of 4 guests, each with their own unique perspective to share. So I'd like to introduce everybody now. First, I'd like to introduce Jason Freeman. He's an assistant professor at Towson University in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminal Justice. Welcome, Jason. Please introduce yourself. Yeah, tell us what your connection to SIGACCESS is.
Yeah, I'm a medical sociologist, and I was actually hired by Dr. Heidi Feng to do the history of SIGACCESS. It is definitely in line with kind of interest in regards to kind of accessibility and health and things along those lines. So yeah, I was hired by Dr. Heidi Feng.
Great. Okay. And next, please welcome Harriet Fell. I was retired from Northeastern University and a former secretary treasurer.
Hi, well, I'm Harriet Fell, and I got into working on assistive technology in the 80s, when my daughter was about 3 years old. Maybe talk about that later. I had come into the College of Computer Science at Northeastern University as one of the founders. I was really a pure mathematician at the time. So I was working in cryptography mostly, and it was really, a big switch to get into working to things related to access.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Harriet. And next up is Vicki Hanson, the ACM CEO and former SIGACCESS chair.
Yeah. I'm a longtime fan, like Shari, of SIGACCESS and ASSETS. I was a researcher in accessibility initially at IBM Research, then moved on. I was continuing to research in the area as a professor at the University of Dundee, and then at Rochester Institute of Technology. In terms of SIGACCESS, I was the chair of it from 2004 to 2009. And I was, vice chair before that. And I also served as the ASSETS general chair for the 2002 conference. And I was a program chair for the 2002 conference and the general chair for the 2010 conference.
Wow.
All right, great. Thank you, Vicki. And we also have Clayton Lewis from the University of Colorado.
Yeah, hi, everybody. So the longer arc of my career has been in human-computer interaction. And I was drawn into working on accessibility through the creation of the Coleman Institute for Cognitive Disabilities here at the University of Colorado, with which I was associated off and on for years. And with that, my sort of focus shifted from the CHI community to the ASSETS community. So I served as vice chair of the SIG for a time and general chair for one of the ASSETS conferences, which was a lot of fun.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody. So a lot of history with SIGACCESS represented here on this panel today. So let's start from the very beginning, way back. How did SIGACCESS actually start? What was the original focus? And Jason has been doing research on this, so I'll hand it over to you.
All right. So just before I get going, so I want to mention that the information I'm presenting actually comes from a dissertation by Dr. Elizabeth Petrick, as well as, who's at Rice University, as well as the newsletters and interviews I've done with various members of the SIG. And so SIG Access really grew out of the ACM Committee for Professional Activities of the Blind, which itself started in 1964. And so, of course, as the name would kind of denote, it was really focused on incorporating or essentially assimilating blind programmers into the existing kind of workplaces at the time. From May 8th to August 20th, 1970, that's where you start to see the SIG, or at the time, the Special Interest Committee start to form. And there were a series of meetings in which they kind of decided on this set of bylaws, as well as they decided to convert the newsletter, which is still in place right now, from being the newsletter focused on professional activities of the blind towards 3 different areas of focus: blind, deaf, and motor impaired individuals. And in 1970, you saw the first SIGCCAF chairperson appointed, and that was Dr. Charles Hallenbeck of the University of Kansas. And so the thing with that particular time is that, you know, he really kind of got the ball rolling with the SIC at the time, Special Interest Committee, and he actually grew the group significantly by about 150 members at the time. He resigned in July 1971 and was replaced in August of 1971 by Robert Gildy, who actually is the one who transitioned the Special Interest Committee on computers and the physically handicapped towards a special interest group on computers and the physically handicapped. And that began in 1971, that kind of process. Now, during that period, 1971, after Dr. Gildy was appointed, there were these 3 goals that were set up for the SIC at the time, the Special Interest Committee. One is to promote the professional interests of computing personnel with physical disabilities. So again, not just the blind community, but also the blind, deaf, and motor impaired. To promote the application of computing and information technology towards solutions of disability problems. And 3, to perform public education, so kind of public outreach to support computing careers for, quote, suitably trained blind, deaf, and motor impaired persons. So again, at this time, it wasn't really focused on accessibility so much as it was on assimilation into workplaces with maybe a few accommodations.
So just to put this in a bit of context, ACM was founded in 1947. The first SIGs began in 1960, and they were formed, as Jason said, to put together communities of people who had like interests for technical research. And as I think we all know right now, these days, the SIGs are really the technical lifeblood of ACM. And by 71, when Jason talked about SIGCCAF becoming a SIC, there were 26 SIGs and 2 special interest committees, the 6. There was a quote from the ACM president at the time that SIGCCAF was the last of the 6 structure. ACM no longer has 6 that are required before formation of a SIG. And his line was something like, with SIGCAS moving into being a SIG, that removed the sickness from ACM. Okay. There's currently 38 ACM SIGs, of which only 12 of these are older than SIG Access, and 1 is the same age as SIG Access, the one that was a SIG at the same time.
So I actually did want to add one thing. So the Social Security Administration basically asked SIGCCAF at the time to help them with a building, a computer lab they were setting up to make it more accessible. And so that was kind of a very early kind of accomplishment of SIGCCAF. So like right after it became a SIG. So basically looked at the architectural kind of, setup of the building and gave some recommendations that actually made it a lot more accessible. So accessibility wasn't a focus at the very beginning, but that was kind of the beginnings of them really focusing on just making, buildings and technology just more accessible to the public. So I just really want to mention that kind of major accomplishment very early on in 1973.
Wow, that's cool. So how did ASSETS start? I think a lot of people know SIG Access mainly through the ASSETS conference. What's the story there?
Okay. So before I talk about the actual conference, I want to talk about kind of what led to it, what I would call a precarious period of the SIG. So in 1978, James Cush kind of mentioned in the newsletter that for the last 6 months they had no leadership. So for 6 months of the period of the SIG, of the existence, they had no one in charge, and it was kind of this group with no leadership. And so he was appointed by the ACM president at the time, and he mentioned that, so now we have a leadership, but we're still not really living up to our kind of charter. A couple years later, in 1980, they gave out this survey about kind of the nature of the SIG, and only 11 of the 259 members responded. And so at the time, the newsletter editor, Wayne Muth, kind of gave a rebuke and kind of, again, also questioned the nature and should we still be a SIG. And then a couple years, number of years later, in 1989, it was mentioned that any kind of significant expenses would essentially wipe out the treasury. So again, because it wasn't really a lot of involvement at the time, they were kind of on the brink of just kind of not having the money to really do very much as a SIG. So it was kind of this precarious period for quite a period of time. But then you had Ephraim Gleinert come in, and he actually did a lot of things that kind of helped get the SIG and kind of shore up the SIG. The major thing being establishing the Assets Conference. Now, very early on, so when he first kind of announced it, he mentioned that he wanted the Assets Conference to be, I'm quoting him here, basically to provide a forum where researchers and developers from academia and industry can meet to exchange ideas and report on new developments related to computer-based systems to help people with impairments and disabilities of all kinds. So when he first announced this new conference, that this is what we want to do. We want to bring people together and kind of help shore up this community, which it ultimately did. Now, the first conference took place between October 31st and November 1st of 1994 in Marina del Rey, California. It had 60 participants, 51 from the US, 3 each from the UK and Japan, 1 each from Switzerland, Germany, and Greece. And by comparison, in 2019, the last time we were it was an in-person conference, it had about 300 participants. So going from like 60 to 300 over that period of time. So it did grow significantly. In that first conference, there were 22 papers that were presented. And very early on, Dr. Gleinert really saw it as a recruiting tool that would kind of bring people into the SIG. And ultimately, a lot of the leadership, including members of this panel, their first kind of socialization into SIG access was through this conference. And so it really kind of accomplished the goal that he set out to essentially shore up the community and really kind of build the membership. And I would say this is one of the major things that allowed the SIG to survive up through today. So to reach a 50th anniversary at this year.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say Ephraim is not only the father of assets, but has really, by creating assets, that has helped to grow the field as a whole, as well as growing the SIG ever since. I think we owe a lot to Ephraim. But let's get back to the 90s. The birth of the internet, the age of PCs and MS-DOS, AOL dial-ups and floppy disks. Harriet, you were a researcher at that time. What was it like in that period before Assets was getting going?
Well, as I said, working in anything computer-human interface related in my university was sort of looked down on. I mean, they're like the real hardcore computer science stuff. And I was in this computer science department, and as I was originally working in pretty pure math kind of stuff, cryptography and such. And I got into working in assistive technology really because of my daughter, not because she's got problems, but when she was born, she was 3 weeks early, which is not very early, but this woman, Linda Ferrier, walked into my hospital room. She was looking for subjects for studies she was doing for a thesis on speech development and preemies. And my daughter was borderline preemie. So for 2.5 years, Linda came to our house and take my daughter and did little tests and things. And then we lost contact. And then again, when my daughter was around 3 years old, 3, 4, I went to pick her up at daycare, and the daycare at Northeastern was in the same building as speech pathology, and I noticed Linda's name on the door. So I called her up and invited her to lunch. And over lunch, we started talking about possible projects. And at the time, I'd been assigned to teach a senior computer science project course. The seniors were supposed to develop projects. And up till that point, whenever they did this course, they all built text editors. And I thought that was pretty boring. So Linda and I brainstormed a bunch of possible projects that we could have the students build instead. And they built a whole bunch of single key games and educational games for kids who really could just hit a big red button, and some speech-driven graphics program where they could actually draw by just talking. And at that time, I mean, there was very little available to do that kind of thing. So it was really pretty novel. And we actually got the stuff used at a couple of local places that had kids with disabilities. But it still really was not looked on as something real by my colleagues. And Linda and I, our first big breakthrough was what we did present at the first Assets conference. And that was our baby Babel blanket. And that led to us getting actual serious funding from the Department of Education. They were the first people to fund us, which made us a little more real. We got a poster session accepted into Kai in Amsterdam, but when we went there, they actually told us, the organizers, that they thought it was a joke and accepted it because they thought it would be funny. And that's all right. We presented it. They were quite surprised that we were for real.
Wow. Were there other people doing similar kinds of things, or were you sort of in a vacuum there?
Not where we were, that's for sure.
So yeah, let's talk about the Assets conferences and what they meant and how they did actually bring people together. So it's time to answer the big question of what is assets? What does assets mean? So originally, when Assets was started, it was optimistically called the annual ACM conference on assistive technologies. And so the AS part in Assets is the first three letters of assistive technologies. And then if you take the first and the last part of each of those words, you get assets. And it's been Assets ever since, even though the actual name of the conference has changed, which has made it even more mysterious than it originally was. Let's talk a little bit about some of those early Assets conferences. So Harriet was at the very, very first Assets in '94.
That's right. And, I don't even remember how I first heard about Assets, but as I said, it seemed to really suit the work that Linda and I were doing at the time. And we submitted a paper on the baby Babel blanket. This was actually a whole paper with some of our first results with it. And as Jason mentioned, it was a really small group. I didn't even realize there were 60 people. I knew there were just the 22 papers, and that Randy Dittler gave an opening address. And, I got to know him afterward. It was really great conference for us because we finally got to meet other people doing the kinds of things we were doing. As I recall, it was primarily about technology for people with hearing, vision, and speech impairments, and little else, but a bunch of interesting papers.
Cool. What did the baby Babel blanket do?
Well, it was intended for babies who just were not vocalizing, and they could lie on this blanket and just sort of bang on various parts and it would make sounds. There was one kid who loved environmental sounds, so it could make the toilet flushing sound somewhere on it. And, so little things like that. We actually had a few kids where it was their total interaction with the world. It was that they could control, they could actually make something happen.
It was way ahead of its time.
Right.
Way ahead. Yeah. And actually my first Assets was the second one, 96. And I remember that you were back there with another presentation related to baby vocalizations. That was fascinating to me. So in 96, when I went to my first Assets, I was a young PhD student at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. My interest was in trying to apply AI to make input devices adapt to their users. And one of my main memories of the conference is sort of sitting at the bar after the first day. It was in Vancouver, so I was sort of 8 hours jet lagged, really too jet lagged to talk, but I was just sitting there kind of soaking up the conversation of all the established researchers talking about different accessibility problems, although that word wasn't really in use back then. But although I was sort of sitting there looking tired, inside I was just so excited. I felt like I really found a place where computer science made sense and had a purpose. And here I still am, all this time later, still working in accessibility. Like, it was pivotal to me, certainly in my career and what I chose to do. So Vicki, your first assets, if we skip past 98, was the fourth one, 2000.
Yeah, so that conference was held in Arlington, Virginia, which is just outside Washington, D.C. I seem to remember that there were about 85 people at the conference at the time, so it was grown a little bit since the first one that Jason mentioned. And I looked over the table of contents from the proceedings for that, and about half of the papers at the time related to blind users of technology in some way, shape, or form. But there were a variety of other topics, as people have been saying. I certainly remember a great paper on brain-computer interfaces at the time, one on dyslexia, and there were several papers related to deafness and language. That was my personal interest in research. And in fact, the way I heard about it was that Marilyn Tremaine, who was the conference chair, came and gave a talk at IBM about this conference. I said, wow, there's a conference on this topic? I didn't know there were that many people interested in the kinds of things I'm interested in. So I went up and I talked to Marilyn at the end of her IBM talk. And I said, if there's anything I can do, let me know, because I'd really like to get involved. And she said, great. But what I do remember from my first assets was exactly what both Harriet and Shari mentioned, was getting to meet a lot of people who had interests, if not exactly like yours, at least somewhat related to yours, and finding out that there was a whole community of people who cared about topics you cared about. I made a lot of friendships at that time. A lot of them still continue to this day. And I think that's one of the things that, since its very beginning and continuing now, has always made Assets such a special conference for people.
Yeah, I agree. And Marilyn, I remember her very clearly from, you know, all of the Assets conferences that I attended after that. She would always, I think she had a huge influence on the community. She would always ask the most excellent, penetrating questions in the kindest, gentlest, friendliest way, you know, and really made people think, but also contributed to that atmosphere, I think, that's very friendly and welcoming and supportive. So last but not least, finally, Clayton caught up with Assets in 2005, where you came in with a bang as the keynote speaker.
Yeah, so Assets 2005 was held in Baltimore. And like others, I can say what I remember most about the meeting is some of the people. So one of the people is Andrew Sears, who's going to be in the narrative of quite a bit from here on. Andrew, for those who know him, is just an amazingly dynamic person. And I remember being struck by him on first encounter. And then another person that some in the audience may still be following is Chris Law, who I think at the time maybe was still a graduate student. These days, Chris is a huge force in the world. He's behind a conference for accessibility professionals that's been very influential, and many other things. He also was influential person in the US federal government, which in many of its agencies, Social Security has already been mentioned, but many federal agencies have played pioneering roles in accessibility, and Chris played a part in that. So I was very impressed by Chris hearing him that first time. And then finally, I often think about a paper by Mary Hart, who at the time had some affiliation with Carnegie Mellon. And she gave a paper that's a reminder for something that we still have to really be on the lookout for, and that is that prejudice and misunderstanding of people with disabilities is a huge issue, and all too often it extends beyond low expectations to active exclusion. So Mary, working in one of the Pittsburgh high schools, learned that so-called special education kids were excluded from computing courses on the grounds that, well, of course they couldn't profit from it, which is absolutely untrue, as work by Jonathan Lazar and Heidi Feng and many others have shown since. But we have to keep reminding ourselves of that. Anyway, Mary reported that she set up a special computing course for these kids who were, by rule, excluded from the courses in their own schools. And many of them had a high level of success there. Thankfully, I think that's one area in which we can say that societally we've made some progress, but it's something we all have to be mindful of. And maybe I'll say a little bit more later about how what people in the assets community work on, while maybe we often feature the sort of technology aspects of it, the human side, and including the policy side, how these things really play out in people's lives is very, very important to what we're all concerned with.
So over the years since then, Assets has moved around, mostly jumping between the east and west coast of the US and Canada, and over a few times in Europe. And of course, last year and this year in cyberspace, where, when I think about it, how great is it that we can explore and make these connections across the whole world and include people across the world now in the middle of a global pandemic. So let's talk a little bit now about how has the research field itself changed over the years and over this time?
Well, the scope of the conferences, as I said in the first conferences, it was primarily about aids for people who were vision impaired, hearing impaired, or speech impaired, and moved on to do a lot with both motor and cognitive disabilities, and also a lot for people across the autism spectrum who face a whole lot of difficulties, varied difficulties. And that was definitely something not in the picture in the early days.
Yeah, I was interested in checking how the engagement with cognitive and language and learning issues has evolved over the years. And the share of attention paid to that has certainly increased, though not dramatically. I think the assets community, and it's already been mentioned a little bit, really from the beginning. I mean, what Harriet says is true. Clear focus on vision and to a smaller extent hearing, but for a long time there has been some representation of cognitive issues. So that's interesting to see. There's also been a varying attention to mobility and motor challenges. So a stalwart of the conference for many years was Torsten Feltzer, and people who attended the conference in some of those middle years will remember Torsten. He was himself someone who lived with a neuromuscular degenerative disease, wheelchair user, and did a huge amount of work, pioneering work really on intelligent wheelchair controls and that kind of thing. So he was a fixture of the conference for quite a while. Sadly, Torsten passed away a few years ago now, and with his passing, maybe it's just because he was so visible, but my sense has been in recent years there's been maybe less attention in that space than there had been. Another thing I think is notable is the broadening of the field, maybe getting into issues that might be associated with the phrase disability studies. So this is moving beyond the sorts of bits and bytes and mechanics of things to consider the lives of people with disabilities more fully, and also including, I guess, policy kinds of issues, but really cultural kinds of issues. And there are many names that could be mentioned, but two would be Jen Mankoff and Rua Williams, who've played a big role, I think, in really kind of opening the thinking of the community. And I'll also say that as with most worthwhile developments, these developments are not without the tensions. You know, people can be kind of comfortable not thinking about some kinds of things, or continuing to think about things in a sort of familiar way. So people like Jen and Rua who take on these things are really to be valued in our community, and they are valued.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that has evolved over the years, of course, is the research methods that people use and what it takes to have a paper in Assets. The standard and the level of depth of research has been growing along with the size of the conference. And although it's always been very empirically oriented and has always included work that is mostly directly with target users, that's kind of evolved now into much more participatory methods, having users involved in research groups, having them shape the research questions and the directions that are taken is something that I think we've seen a lot of progress in over the course of the years, which is really positive. I think, I think we need to take whatever actions we can so that representation from researchers with disabilities will grow and be nourished by the SIG. I think another thing that's changed, of course, is the language that we use to talk about disability. And looking back at some of the old proceedings, you read terminology that makes you wince now, and it's kind of humbling to know that in 10 or 20 years from now, the terms that I'm using today will make people wince. But there's a constant evolution in the language and the terminology and the way that individual groups want to describe themselves. And it's something that SIGACCESS has tried to help authors understand and keep up with.
Actually, this happened, started about 2007, 2008. And at the time, Anna Cavender and Shari and I were all together at IBM. I think it may have been Anna who actually said, we need to write a paper about this, not just sort of complain among ourselves. And that's when we put the guidelines together. The point here was really that words matter, and the words that you use to talk about people, describe their characteristics, really can affect people and how they feel, and generally create a perception about feeling. So we thought it was very important that people start talking correctly or differently, maybe than they were in some of the early writings that appeared in Assets. One of the things we did admit at the beginning, like what Shari just said now, was that language usage changes over time. So what we wrote in 2008 wasn't necessarily going to stand up 10, 20 years later. And in point of fact, in 2015, we did already update the guidelines, and yes, those were published in Interactions, and you can look those up. But a link to those are also available on the SIGACCESS website.
Yeah, it's probably time for another update.
That's probably true. Yeah.
So as the field has been changing, how has the SIG changed alongside with that?
Okay. So my first conference, as I said, was the 2000 conference. And at the end of the conference, I remember someone came over and said, will you run for SIGACCESS office? So they put me up for vice chair. And, I'd only heard about this whole thing a few months earlier. So I was a little nervous. But anyway, I was put on the slate. I did get elected as vice chair, and Andrew Sears was elected as secretary treasurer at the time. It was a great feeling to be elected. And then right after that, all the troubles began. The person who was elected chair disappeared. And after a year of him not answering anybody, ACM brought me in and said, hey, you're being put in transition, which is basically being put on probation. They removed the person who had been elected chair and installed me as chair of the SIG at the time. And I had to appoint a vice chair. according to the bylaws. And I appointed Jennifer Mankoff, who's already been mentioned here. The most dramatic thing that I think we did during the transition time is when we changed the name of the SIG. We realized at the time that SIGCAF wasn't really appropriate for a number of reasons, and it certainly wasn't reflecting the interests of all of the people who were involved in the SIG and the conference at the time. So we sent out a survey to the membership asking them for suggestions for names and why the name should be what they were suggesting. And SIGACCESS was the clear winner for the membership at the time. So we rewrote the SIG bylaws and got the name changed to SIGACCESS at the time. And we had to do a lot to replenish the SIG's finances, get the newsletters back on track. But finally, 2005, mission accomplished. And the SIG governing board instated SIGACCESS as a full and permanent SIG within the hierarchy. Yeah.
Yay, thank you, Vicki.
So a couple other things that happened during that time, just quickly. There was the move from 1 year, from an every other year assets to an annual assets. That was done primarily because the SIG, I had noticed that the conference was about the same size every year. And we were wondering if we changed it to an annual conference, if we would get a greater attendance. The idea being that you could count on having a conference every year at about the same time. So you'd prepare for it, plan your papers for it, that kind of thing. We took a gamble in 2004 and said, yep, we're going to have a conference in 2005. And I have to admit that Andrew Sears kind of pushed me into this. He's more of a gambler than I am. And it did pay off. The conference increased a bit in size in 2005 from what it had been. And the following year, the conference, so this was the second time it was an annual conference, had nearly 200 people. So it just hugely increased by making this change to make it an annual conference when people really could understand that it was going to be a real and regular event. And the other thing that started about this time was the T-Access Journal. And again, this was Andrew Sears pushing me into it. He really thought that the field should have a journal. He and I proposed a journal to ACM's publications board, and it was accepted. And in May 2008, transactions on accessibility began.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
And after your time as chair, of course, Andrew took over as chair of SIGACCESS, so it was all smooth sailing with Andrew at the helm. Really, it was just to fill in the gaps after Andrew. It was me, and both Andrew and I stayed for 6 years, so we're clinging on to our power there, maybe for longer than we should. And now it's passed on to Matt Hunnerfauth, participant in the very first doctoral consortium at ASSETS, which is lovely. And
I will say, you said something about holding on to power longer than you should have. I actually, so I was the chair for 5 years. We went from 2-year to 3-year terms during my time, but it was really hard for me to say I wouldn't run for a third time because I loved being SIGACCESS chair. Eventually, I was persuaded that new leadership would bring in new ideas, and I thought that would be good for the SIG, and that has happened.
Andrew has the prize for being the most long-serving SIGACCESS executive committee member, because he has 14 years between his time as the secretary treasurer and then vice chair, and then 6 years as the chair. So thank you, Andrew. What do you all see or hope for in the future of SIGACCESS and ASSETS? And I'm going to give everybody a chance to speak here. Let's start with Jason.
Okay. So I've learned a lot about SIGACCESS over the last couple years. And so one of the things that I'm really kind of excited about kind of area is kind of the increased involvement of kind of end users who are from the disabled community, as well as researchers as well. So I'm actually in the process of learning more about that right now in my research, but that's one thing I think is really important, and I think is happening right now. So one of the interviews used the term for like the very beginning of the SIG as kind of paternalistic, and that's definitely something that is very much part of the past. So just kind of going from that to kind of being more inclusive and having it again, disabled end users and researchers having a much bigger part of the SIG, I think is an exciting part of the SIG going forward.
Yeah. Harriet, how about you? What are your thoughts?
I guess, first of all, I think in the distant future, there may be no need for the SIG because medical research will remove disabilities. I mean, really help people restore their abilities to being everything they want. That's pretty far in the future. In the interim, and but still being, I think science fiction, I see brain interfaces as being very important, and maybe implanted chips as a way of getting people to control their muscles, to even see, to send signals to the brain that the brain can then process, as well as in the other direction, excuse me, having, brain interfaces that allow people to move. So I have no idea how that's going to happen. I think there's a little bit of that kind of thing going on, but it's mostly science fiction for the time being. And I think it's really something that, people think about, interacting with computers in more direct ways.
Okay, yeah. How about you, Vicki?
This is a little off topic perhaps, but I just want to say I hope that the kind of information that Jason's been collecting and has been talked about in this panel gets preserved and written down somewhere in SIGACCESS where everybody can read it. ACM is the oldest computing society globally. So ACM knows a lot about their past. ACM's history committee is working a lot on the ACM history, not on the SIG history, but they feel that it's important not only that ACM look toward the future of what technology is going to bring, but also document the past so we can learn from the past.
Clayton, how about you?
So first, I want to second what Jason said. We have been making some progress in the meeting in having more participation by people with disabilities. The experience reports have really aimed at that, and some other things we've tried to do, but we have a long way to go there. And that's something that's on my mind right now, and maybe it is for many others, is the role of AI attention. Maybe everybody in the audience is tracking the fact that there's kind of a revolution within a revolution happening in AI nowadays. So with language model based approaches, we're seeing some dramatic changes in what AI systems can do in a way that may really be transformative for our field. So one of the things that we've worked on at the Coleman Institute is whether we could provide artificial human assistants for people who need them for supporting their activities. Well, the very recently announced Codex model from OpenAI does an amazing amount of this. Working through what this technology is going to mean, I think is going to be an important priority for the community, and I think is likely to lead to many really valuable improvements.
Over the 50-year history of SIGCAF and SIGACCESS, technology has changed so much, and AI is the thing that's right in front of us right now that is transforming potential to transform accessibility, but transforming the world already in the ways that it's applied, and it's something that we have to pay attention to and make sure that not only is the potential explored, but also new risks or new potential barriers are identified and solutions are found. And I think one thing that I hope SIGACCESS will keep working on is other dimensions of diversity and inclusion. I think we need to keep building our our racial, cultural, ethnic diversity, and the attention that we pay to how accessibility problems show up in other places in the world outside of the places where assets has been and where a lot of research attention has already been paid. And I guess my biggest hope is that the community retains the energy and passion and the welcoming, supportive, really eclectic nature of who and what it brings together, people working on very different problems. And I think that's, for me, that's the magic of SIGACCESS and assets. So thank you all so much for coming and joining in this conversation with me. This was a fantastic trip down memory lane, and hopefully we'll get some interesting questions when people see this at the conference.